Hello guys, we're going to talk about, in this case, about the crisis of the late Middle Ages. After a period of growing in the high Middle Ages, I mean in the 8th, 9th and 10th, even 11th century, there was a deep crisis in the 14th century. And this crisis affected demography, economy and agriculture. And was what we used to call the late Middle Ages. Okay, so let's go to take into in the period. Okay, as I said, we have the 11th and the 13th century where there was an economic growth. But if we go to the 14th century, started to decrease the economy and to start a crisis. This crisis was caused by the following facts: a climate change, an overexploitation, famine, and destructive wars. Let's go to climate change. Okay, depending on the age, each 1,000, 2,000 years, the climate, depending on which area, changes a bit. And in this case, in the Middle Ages, the climate in Europe changed a bit. And this was because the precipitations increased. And this made the farms lost many crops. So the farming lost advantages. Secondly, the other fact was the overexploitation. And this was because the farmers tried to supply and provide with food to the large populations, and there was no enough food for such amount of people, and farmers tried to farm over exploiting the farmings, and the soil as a consequence became poor. As a consequence, the poor soil became into famine. And what is famine? Famine means hungriness, hambruna, gente con hambre. And this famine or hungriness was because of the reason of the poor soils and the few agricultural products for so many people increased the prices, and there was no money to pay such prices to buy food, and famine spread it over Europe. And at last, but not the least, was destructive wars, as the one we talked about once in class, that was the Hundred Years' War. Okay, this war consists of England trying to conquer France, invading it, because the King of England thought that he was the future King of France, but some other people was in front of him, and this became into a war. So this war lasted not only 100 years, but even more, 120 years, more or less. For you to know, this war was very destructive all over Europe, but overall in France. Okay, besides the crisis in the agriculture, we have another kind of facts to give reasons for the crisis, which was the social tensions. And that social tensions were concentrated in two places. The first place is the countryside. As you can think, the population, because of the famine, decreased, and the taxes from the monarchy increases. So if the taxes increases while the population decreases, there is less people to pay taxes, and there will be less taxes paid. So this drives to peasant rebellions because the peasant had no money and taxes were increased. So peasants were supposed to pay even more money when they hadn't any money. So started to be peasant rebellions. One of the most important was the so-called Jacquerie in 1358, which was held in France. Because of that reason, peasants hadn't enough money to pay the so high taxes, and they decided to go in a rebellion. But however, there were another revolts or rebellions throughout Europe, like in England, in Spain, in Italy, etc. But another consequence of the social tension was celebrated in the second place, which was the cities. And what happened in the cities? In this case, in the cities, decreased the amount of food because of the famine and the poor soils. And as a consequence, the artisans in this case and some other merchants and other workers in the city created riots. A riot is like una revuelta ciudadana, una revuelta urbana. And riots were very dangerous in that age. There were celebrated riots in Florence in 1378, or in Munich, or in Madrid, in Paris, in Rome, and in other important cities to protest against the lack of food. But far from overcome those problems, it came the biggest one, which is the demographic disaster. And what is this about? Okay, between 1348 and 1352, it was spread a plague, a terrible bacterial disease. As a consequence of this bacterial disease, the mortality in Europe was extremely high and risen extremely. So population at that time was badly nourished and did not live in hygienic conditions. So as a consequence, the population decreased so hardly. And then this destructive plague was known as the Black Death. This Black Death was the most destructive anybody remembers and affected overall the cities. So many died corpses, lay down on the floor in the streets. And most of them had to be buried underground in bad conditions. As you can see in this graph, from the middle years of the 14th century, the population decreased a lot because of that Black Death, which affect the most of Europe. In this case, this graph represents the case of England. This plague came from Asia and is being spread over throughout Europe, affected all Europe, even Spain, and at last 25 million people died. So guys, this is all about the crisis in the late Middle Ages. I hope you paid attention, and next day I will ask you about that. So see you tomorrow. Goodbye.